Hi, everybody. So my name is Leslie Ekker, and I've always felt the sacredness of beauty. I feel like the creation of beauty and the cultivation of it is an expression of the highest order, and I try to manifest it through my core values of creativity, fun, and excellence. I've been a designer and a visual effects artist and technician for about 34 years now, and it just gets more interesting to me every year. And so the question I'm here to ask you is, what is beautiful?
A computer that works.
No, I got it. So the question is, what is beautiful? And so, inside each of us, we already know the answer. It's something that only we can visualize ourselves in our mind's eye. And so we conjure images that represent our individual concepts of beauty. Only you know what that looks like. And beauty makes us feel, and feelings can make us beautiful. Visual effects artists and visual artists have worked for thousands of generations, for 1,000 generations, to try to manifest that intangible vision in a pursuit that will never end. And as a visual effects supervisor, I tend to think a lot about vision, perception, and the stories that images tell. In my trade, we strive to recreate reality and to create the impossible reality from imagination. So an understanding of what reality is helps, right? Well, good luck. Today, I'd like to talk about that reality simply from the standpoint of beauty and its foundation in feeling and story, where it all begins and ends. Visual storytelling is an agreement between the viewer and the artist. When we go to see a movie, we agree to surrender our minds to an alternative world for a little while. We'll experience some other life, some other existence, and we'll experience it without risk, except for the cost of the ticket and the popcorn. And the depth of our immersion into that alternate universe has a great impact on the lasting effect of it. Any distraction from our experience of the story dilutes or even shatters our immersion, and it breaks that sacred agreement between storyteller and viewer. In visual effects, we try to create immersive, impossible worlds for you to submerge into. So how can we create better, impossible worlds? What invites a deeper immersion and a more complete surrender? Most of you are already aware of the current trend in cinematic presentation towards greater and greater levels of realism. And to a lot of influential people, this goal of realism has been taken to mean greater clarity of image, added dimension, brighter, sharper, more colorful, higher contrast, and so on. It can be said that the goal of a good story is to cast a spell on you, to reach into your heart, and to generate emotions through sympathetic experience, and to reveal truths through that experience. Do we need a clearer image to achieve that? Well, maybe. Think of a memory of a delightful moment. Aren't you glad I didn't ask for a scary one? Maybe you're watching a movie of that moment in your mind right now. You're seeing it in your head. It's beautiful, right? Well, let's take a look at that. Of course, your results may differ, but for me, it's definable. It's dynamic, it's cozy, it's exciting, it's sensual, it's beautiful. None of which really describe an image. They all describe emotion. They describe feeling and sensation. So now, we have to ask the question, is that memory played in 3D at 4K and 60 frames per second? Or is it more like Vivaldi, vanilla, and velvet? You see, I think that the mind's eye really appears more like the way our own eyes actually see. Now, human vision may not be what you think it is. What we see is not the light from a scene that enters our eyes. The brain processes light to produce an idea of a scene from a mosaic, from a composite of snapshots. And that idea is our interpretation of the visual information we're taking in. It's informed by all the other visual information we've ever taken in. And we learn how to see beginning at infancy. We learn how to see and continue that education. We continue it for the rest of our lives with each novel sight. Novelty engages our minds. And so when we see a scene, the first time we see it, here's a simple picture of some people in a room. The first time we see it, our eyes skip around rapidly. This is a map of where people's eyes would go in this image. And with each subsequent viewing, we've learned that scene a little bit more, and we begin to refocus our attention on the things that attract or perhaps repel us most. And so we've learned how to see that particular scene. It's a case of novelty teaching us how to see, and we learn how to see with every new scene we encounter. A camera sees without interpretation, and it sees without experience. We add that interpretation from our personal experience to be able to see. A favorite quote of mine is by Anais Nin, who said, "We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are." And of course, she meant it philosophically. And as useful as that idea has been to me philosophically, I believe it also applies to vision. The aggregated memories of scenes we felt were beautiful or were associated with good moments comprise each one of our own archetype of image beauty. It's a personal thing. We're 80% visual creatures, and the world presents us with light. It's emitted, it's transmitted, refracted, reflected, and our eyes organize it into focused and adjusted signals that our brains then assemble into concepts of the world, assisted by the other senses. These concepts are the product of all of our learning, and the moment producing an image in the mind. If you were to look out my living room window, it might look something like this in reality. The center 30 degrees is sharp and colorful. Outside of a 60-degree cone of vision, it rapidly falls off in contrast and detail. It gets distorted. We actually have a lot of barrel distortion in the edges of our vision, but our brains have taught us to ignore that. And this is why you need to assemble mosaics of scenes. When I look at this room, I can only see the center section, really, and it's only by skipping around and compositing those layers of mosaic that I begin to understand the scene I'm presented with. So how can we see so clearly when we're always looking down a funnel? You have the ability to hold the composite of that scene in visual shorthand in your mind. When you're introduced to a scene, whether it's live or displayed, your eyes will dart about and your brain registers snapshots of that scene. And when you're confronted with novelty, well, we don't believe our eyes. We double take, we blink and stare, and our eyes skip around, learning a new reality and assembling new composites from that unexpected experience. And when we compile those snapshots into a mosaic of a scene, concentrating our attention on what attracts or repels us, we fill in the gaps with what we expect, drawn from previous experience. So when we learn, we miss a lot, and we fill it in with our experience. That's why eyewitnessing can be so unreliable. It's artistic, and it fits in with our expectations of the world that we are. So our challenge is to create a convincing reality for the viewer, and so we have to define what reality is. We try to present ever more convincing realities delivered visually, and the medium of that presentation is in film or video. It's human vision. And so to reach that level of emotional communication, a connection with the heart and mind of the viewer, we need to penetrate the subconscious. That presents a choice. Do we deliver realism or impressionism? How much visual information do we need to make an emotional connection with our viewer? It seems that we can go in either direction here. We can say that an impressionistic imagery is more emotional, and in opposition, an exquisitely detailed photorealism can trick the mind and body to accept that scene as real. Your mind will then translate that realistic presentation into the visual shorthand of your individual visual dialect. That means that it becomes impressionistic because of our way of seeing. So artists create emotion by offering less visual information. Our minds fill in the gaps to fit our profile of beauty through interpretation. Any trip through a museum and you'll experience that with every work of art you see. The trend now is toward higher and higher clarity of presentation. Resolution is a major vehicle for that, and movies today are shown in what we call 2K resolution, or about 2,000 pixels across. That's the yellow rectangle there. High-def television is very much the same, very close to that. So for a variety of reasons, some of them self-serving, the industry is moving toward ever higher levels of resolution. 4K is here now, in some way, and many think that 12K is the eventual destination of this trend in increased resolution. And there are significant technical hurdles to surmount to achieve that leap to 4K. The question is why? It looms ever larger. The human eye can perceive only a limited amount of resolution. Apple's Retina display on a lot of people's phones and iPads, it exceeds that resolution even held close up. So sitting in a theater, you'd have to sit closer than a myopic teenager, really, to appreciate the difference between 2K and 4K. Add to that a 3D presentation at 48 or even 60 frames per second, and you have a torrent of visual information. Is that a bad thing? Well, I think it may not be. I don't think so. If the imagery is effective, it can work pretty well because you're presented with a realism that sells, that the body accepts. But if you add to that editorial pacing, theater sound, extra pair of glasses, your mileage may vary. It's an interesting question. Some people say that it requires a generational adaptation. Young people today may feel very differently about it when they reach my age. And Peter Jackson's Hobbit was presented at 48 frames per second in 3D. At 2K resolution, it created a storm of critique, including praise and a lot of prejudice. Some people felt that it lacked a filmic look, and it felt like a soap opera. Well, that's one term for it. And while it served the action scenes by reducing motion blur and enabling you to see things more like they would have been if you were really there, it did seem to suffer from a certain flatness when things slowed down and the lighting was brighter. And it was also in 3D, so it still felt flat. And that's really because the eye just doesn't see that way. It's a mixed message for the brain. Your eyes are focusing on a screen that's 30 feet away from you, but your brain is receiving information, depth cues, which don't agree with that distance of focus. So there's this conversation in your brain of that's not real, but it feels real, but it's not real. And it takes you out of the experience, unless it's done really just right. So, you know, Peter Jackson shot at 48 frames per second, and the reason was that that's the highest speed his cameras would synchronize at, and so that was his choice for the speed. But now, today, you can synchronize at 120 frames per second, so brace yourself, it's coming. Visual effects wizard Doug Trumbull created a film system in the mid-'80s called ShowScan. ShowScan was interesting. It ran at 60 frames per second, and he shot it on 70mm film. So it was extremely high resolution, and there was no motion blur, no flicker, and it was projected with enormous dynamic brightness. And it was, it's interesting because people's bodies responded to this in a really profound way, much more different than a regular film presentation. So the way the eye works has a lot to do with why ShowScan was so effective. If you look around on this pattern here, you may see some black dots at the outside of your cone of vision, and just keep trying to find those black dots for me, all right? So the eye can retain an image for about a 24th of a second. If it switches to a negative of that, and then it switches to a negative of that image for a fraction of a second longer, depending on the brightness and contrast of the image. So here's another example. Just stare at that black cross in the center for a moment, and you might notice that that green dot going around and around erases the pink dots, and eventually maybe there's just a green dot. Is that working for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, now try looking at the red dots. There is no green dot, and the red dots never disappear. If you look back at that black square, it's tricking you again. So this is part of the trickery of our vision. So I'll just leave that up there. You guys tripping on that? It's pretty cool, huh? So, you know, it's pretty spooky because this is really proof that our brains are really not being honest with us. So with ShowScan, the result of the high frame rate was an image that had no visible film grain, no motion blur, and brightness like you would see outdoors. And the audience responded to that movement physically, involuntarily leaning into turns on a road or squirming uncomfortably from the close-up, intimate whisperings of a beautiful woman. A lot of people thought Doug's movies were in 3D because the surface of the screen actually disappeared to them. They were always 2D, but it didn't feel like that because your brain forgot that it was looking at a projection. It was a very affecting peek into the future. Doug Trumbull's now pursuing the next evolution made possible by huge leaps in technology since the 80s. And Peter Jackson's emphasized that The Hobbit was just a first step, an opening experiment in increased realism. Enough green dot. That's better. So technology is ever expanding. Right now, it's possible to present 4K resolution, 3D stereoscopic at 60 frames per second with incredible brightness to create a viewing experience that mimics reality more than ever. Only one problem, well, actually two problems. There are no theaters for it, and there are no movies. That much realism does promise to approach real world, and it also presents a new risk. Imagine a bad movie that looks so real it even feels bad. The responsibility of filmmakers to deliver acceptable experiences becomes even more onerous. So maybe that technology looks real, but does it really feel more beautiful? Probably, sorry. Okay, so you've certainly seen a film with an amazing story. And you probably were so engrossed in the story and the emotion of it that you forgot for a moment where you were. Maybe you were moved to tears, excited for the adventure, fearful for your life or the life of a character. You were riding the tale to the end and surfacing as a changed person. That experience transformed you, and now you see the world in a new way. Well, we've all had that experience, and if you haven't, see my wife Diane afterwards for some suggestions. So when did the quality of the images of that movie ever get in the way of the engrossing story? It's likely that it didn't. Alternatively, if the same story were well presented in hyper-realovision, would it hurt the experience? Well, I doubt it. It's really all about story. Ultimately, it's the foundation of all things. We're linear communicators. We even think in story. Without it, the medium is irrelevant. If hyperrealism in media enhances our experience of the story, then so be it. But if it detracts or it doesn't contribute to it, then it's just technology for its own sake. And if there's a way of presenting a story in a visual dialect with stylization that engages and contributes and supports the feeling of the story, that's the domain of the artist. So I look forward to a day when the resolution wars have burned out, leaving a wanting, a possibility for humanity, for messiness, for the texture and flavor of an extension of the story we surrender our hearts to. So what is that flavor? Well, each of us knows it in our mind's eye, and the artists strive to describe it for all of us. Already today, some animation films begin to approach that level of expressionism in a medium where the world is completely synthesized. So the artist has the opportunity to create a reality that's more directly emotional and less clinical. That trend's advancing fast, and we find ourselves in a renaissance today of animation storytelling. And I see a day when the same kind of artistic stylization may find its way through technology into live action films. The pace of innovation is relentless. It exists for its own sake, and it's driven by people like us, explorers, the curious, and innovators. And there is an alternate route to the heart through art, a way of using the tools, both old school and new, to create visions from within the mind and to bypass the real and take us into the world of the artful. Visually telling the story with impression and interpretation, not resolution and reality. Depicting with grace, not force, with fluency in the shorthand of the mind's eye. So is it fidelity, frame rate, and 4K, or is it vanilla, velvet, and Vivaldi? Beauty is, after all, in the eye of the beholder.